Well, hello and welcome to an all new episode of the Transfix Take Podcast, where each week we deliver news, insights, and trends for shippers and carriers. It's the week of January 31st, and I'm Jenny Ruiz, and I'm joined by our market expert, none other than Justin Mays. Mays, how's it going?
It's going great, Jenny. I can't believe we're already coming to the end of January so quickly.
It came and went and gave us a lot of surprises.
I was going to say, it's been quite a month already in 2024 for the freight markets.
Oh, yeah, we're off to a bit of a wild start here. And now that you mentioned it, according to Scott Pecorariello, who's the CEO of Weather Optics, 14 out of the top 53 lanes are expected to experience high or extreme weather impact over the next 7 days, specifically in the western part of the U.S., which includes states like California, Utah, Colorado, and Washington, while the rest of the country kind of gets a break from that snow and rain we've seen over the last 14 days, if you could believe it. So, Mays, my question for you is, what did we see last week heading into the weekend?
Well, Jenny, we certainly saw capacity start easing, but that doesn't necessarily lead to rates and tender rejections decreasing at the same time, just yet at least. We've seen some very interesting data, though, over the last 2 weeks. Even as capacity eases, it's not necessarily leading to the downward rate trend that most shippers and anyone that joins our podcast would anticipate.
Okay. Now, I imagine based on what you just said, but rates and rejections are still kind of funky. So, give us some specifics on where we landed since we last spoke.
Yeah, of course, Jenny. We knew that the country was going to thaw out last week, as we called out, and temperatures increased. At the same time, like I mentioned, capacity has eased. It's cooled down. But the decrease in tender rejections and rates really was experienced in the beginning of last week. Since about Wednesday, things have basically hovered at a flat line. Van tender rejections just under 5%, and reefer rejections still over 10%. Wow. And Jenny, my eye is really drawn here because it's the first time in well over 12 months that we've seen tender rejections remain high off of a spike for a prolonged period. Now, normally, we see tender rejections spike around holidays, fall right back down, but we haven't seen that just yet. And I would probably assume that's why we continue to see rates at the national level remain pretty high at the average rate per mile. But I still think in the coming days, we're going to continue to see that easing flow into the data with rates falling back down, along with tender rejections. But it's something to definitely keep an eye on because, again, rates at a market or a lane level, we're certainly seeing differences from where we were a week ago.
And I'm sure we'll continue to see those differences go up and down over the next month or so. But you know what? It's time for the regional breakdown. Now, we're just about 2 weeks away from Valentine's Day. And last week you noted reefer freight would be something to keep an eye on, like you just mentioned, specifically out in the Southeast with Miami flour imports from Colombia. What are some other areas that you've seen movement in?
Yeah, well, Jenny, I would say that, going back to our conversation last week, the Midwest and Northeast have really opened up with capacity. And what this is bringing is that capacity wants to go there because rates remain high in the Midwest and Northeast. So carriers are flocking to go and take advantage of those higher rates. We called out last week, but rates going into the West Coast continue to be an undesirable location for carriers, so rates are higher. Overall, I think we're going to continue to see every region gain some capacity, bring on looser rates in the next week or so. Now, as you called out, we are approaching Valentine's Day. We are seeing reefer rejections remain high along with rates. This is going to likely remain for the next 2 or so weeks, especially as you called out down in South Florida.
Good thing for carriers. Shippers is going to be an interesting story for the next couple of weeks. But, as you mentioned, my guess is the Northeast is still trying to clear out inbound and outbound shipments that were backlogged from Winter Storm Heather. What do rates look like here?
Yeah, over the last week, we've continued to see pressure in the Northeast. And this is going to drag into the coastal when we get to the coastal region. Yeah. But the Northeast, the largest markets by volume, Harrisburg and Elizabeth, New Jersey, saw pretty sizable rate increases from last week to this week. Now, this week, winter weather for the most part is pretty cleared up. I mean, we're still seeing some snow in upstate New York and parts of New England. But where freight ships out of, we're not seeing that winter weather. We're going to see rates, in my belief, rapidly decrease. That is going to the Midwest and staying within the Northeast. But again, if carriers are headed to the West Coast from the Northeast, they're going to demand a higher cost because they're leaving a very hot market for a market that they know they're not going to get the same type of rate per mile.
Yeah. Cross-country runs through the Midwest almost incurred a 1% increase, but I see long hauls trending down. And maybe that tells a story similar to what you're talking about now. How is the Midwest recovering from last week, Maze?
I would say the Midwest is opening up even more than the Northeast.
Wow.
It doesn't matter whether it's Wisconsin, Indiana, or Michigan. Every state is feeling that capacity come back. It's a lot easier for shippers to start moving freight after the backlog of the last, 3 weeks now.
Yeah.
On the opposite side, there are still remote areas up in the flyover states, the Dakotas, Iowa, even parts of Minnesota that are still seeing some difficulty. These markets aren't volume drivers. The main volume driving markets are seeing the greatest decreases in tender rejections and rates.
So we're here at the coastal region, which is the area that's, I think, the one to look out for. And inbound and outbound rates through this region continue their increase for carriers. So, Maze, is this region going to let up anytime soon, or will it remain in lockstep with the Northeast and the Midwest?
You're right, Jenny. The coastal region's been pretty stubborn.
Yeah.
But we're really starting to see a divide where the Carolinas actually are starting to experience some softening.
Okay.
But Virginia, Maryland, they're feeding off of that tightness in the Northeast because at the end of the day, if Harrisburg market or even New Jersey needs some capacity, they're going to start pulling from Virginia and Maryland. So I believe going into this week, that need in the Northeast isn't going to be there, and we're going to see rates most likely see the most significant decrease in the coastal region.
Interesting. Now, the story in the West Coast is an interesting one. We noted at the top of the show that there were going to be some severe delays in several markets in this region, but it seems to be the most beneficial for shippers. What's happening here?
Yeah, Jenny, the West Coast continues to be, not the Gold Coast, to say,
Yeah.
for carriers. Rates have continued to trend down now for weeks, especially out of the state of California. Now, there is some pockets of tightening in Southern California, but still, shippers are seeing themselves pay less money this week than they were last week. More notably, the Pacific Northwest has really loosened up. This is something we would have expected throughout the entire month of January, but due to all the winter storms, we've seen the Pacific Northwest remain tight. But right now, we are seeing, Washington, Oregon, even Northern California loosen up the greatest week over week. And unless we start seeing some capacity disruption, which could really happen with your callouts,
Yep.
The West Coast is going to continue to be on that downward spiral. But, I do believe we might see some capacity disruption in parts of California that experience some, large-scale flooding. And then in states like Utah and Colorado where it's snow and it blocks and potentially closes the roadways.
Yeah, we're going to have to see what happens over the next 7 days there, possibly even on Friday. I want to move over to the southeast. This region seems to be the quietest one as we gear up for an influx of flowers. Fun fact, roughly 500 truckloads of flowers are shipped out of the Miami market. Tell us what we can expect here.
Yeah, Jenny, you're spot on. As we approach Valentine's Day, like we called out, it's going to start heating up in South Florida. We're already experiencing it, especially for freight that stays within the state of Florida. We are seeing rates continue their increase. Now, there's more rural areas of Southeast and Alabama and Mississippi that are seeing a decrease, but overall, the highest volume markets, even in Atlanta, we're seeing still rates kind of hold a flat line with a slight increase. Now, going into next week, after the end of month, I think we're going to start seeing capacity and rates ease up in the Southeast, where in a large scale, we're going to see rates fall. But in South Florida, we're going to continue to see that momentum in the carrier's favor.
All right, now closing out with the South, it continues to decrease in rates across all hauls or all lengths of hauls. What are some of the markets you're looking at here, and will the losses keep coming?
We got to keep an eye on Dallas and Fort Worth. It's a big driving market for volume. We're continuing to see that, downward pressure, as you called out. Now, I still think there's plenty of room to go down because of the winter storms bringing up rates so fast.
Yeah.
But keep an eye on Houston, Dallas, Fort Worth. They really drive the entire South. But I don't see any stopping of the downward trend on cost and capacity. Now, again, it's going to be lane by lane. Freight going back to the West Coast is not desirable for carriers, even from the South. So it's really going to be on the freight originating in the South, going to the Midwest and the Northeast, where you start seeing the greatest decreases come.
All right, now we took some big bets at the top of the month. It is the 31st, so let's give our audience a recap of what they are. First one was we predicted significant fall in rates throughout January, surpassing the declines that we saw last year this time. I think it's fair to say Mother Nature may have changed things for us here. What do you think, Maze?
You're spot on, Jenny. Mother Nature forced us to take a detour through the month of January. We took a different turn and went a different direction, but a more favorable one for carriers who had a tough 2023.
Yeah.
Rates are end of the month actually higher than when we started, which is not typical for the month of January. But like you called out, Mother Nature had different plans for the freight markets this month, along with not just the freight markets, but carriers staying in business. We're giving some more life to carriers. Now, again, I don't think this is going to be prolonged. I do think we're going to start seeing the market come down off of the winter storm high, let's call it.
Yeah.
But it was a different ending to the month that we would have originally anticipated, for sure.
Keeps things interesting, Now, you hinted at this just a second ago. We predicted that the impact of the great carrier purge may not be felt until later this year. What was the response that we saw in carrier exits this month?
We didn't really see much of a change, and I think it has to do with that winter weather.
Yeah.
The winter weather, pushed rates higher. It really started closing that gap between spot and contract, which is still pretty large, but it's keeping, some of the smaller carriers that have struggled, it's giving them a little more life. The big deciding factor is, again, going to be, do we continue to see these rates at a flat line like we have in the last week, or do we start seeing them fall as we cross over the end of January in the coming days?
Well, we will have some big bets for you in February at the next recording. Now, I want to close out with don't miss out on our diesel download webinar with Ben Vulcan, who is our Director of Data Analytics at Transfix, on Wednesday, which if you're watching, it is today, January 31st at 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. With that, we'll see you next week with an all-new episode of the Transfix Take Podcast. Until then, as always, drive safely. Maze, any guesses on who's going to win the Super Bowl? 2 weeks.
I'm going to say San Fran. I'm a big San Fran fan. I don't know if they're the underdogs technically, but, Kansas City, we saw them in it the last 2 years. So I was a big Detroit fan. I really wanted to see Detroit go all the way, just to be, America's team, the big underdog. But unfortunately, it didn't happen.
I'm with you on San Fran, so let's see what happens. And if you change in the next week or so, because we've got 2 weeks going on. But with that, we'll see you next week.
See ya.